I am delighted to welcome you to another episode of Causonomics, where I sit down with business leaders and experts to discuss all things service, economics, society, and how we move the UK back into long-term sustainable growth. Now, I'm very excited about today's guest, who is incredibly experienced in the financial services sector with a true passion and leader of all things customer. Dame Alison Rose joins me today to chat about what it takes to make a strong business leader, and crucially, a business leader who understands the importance of centering around the customer experience to improve profitability. I really hope you enjoy this afternoon's conversation. A very warm welcome to everybody today, and I am delighted to be joined by the wonderful Alison Rose. Dame Alison Rose served as Chief Executive at the NatWest Group for a number of years, and prior to that held a whole host of roles both in commercial and private banking. She's a formidable lady and someone that I've had the privilege of knowing for just a short while. Alison was the Prime Minister's Business Council and also served on the government's Energy Task Force for the Net Zero Council. She's worked on leadership initiatives across government, and also, I know something very dear to her heart is about women starting businesses, and she launched the Rose Review back in March 2019, which she's been updating annually on the progress of women in business and in particular around female entrepreneurship. So I'm sure we'll cover that as well. So a big champion of diversity and the progression of women. So let's kick off the conversation. Tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what has made you get to where you are today.
Well, firstly, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So my background, I've been in financial services for 35 years, and probably like most people, when I started my career, I was looking for certain things out of a career. I wanted to travel. I wanted to work with, really smart people. I wanted to do something which was going to be fun and challenged me and give me opportunities. And so I joined NatWest Markets at the time and joined banking and on the graduate scheme, which was brilliant because then I tried lots of different things. And in doing that, figured out what I wanted to do. And my original plan, I'm a nightmare for HR people, and my original plan was to be there for 3 or 4 years and then hopefully go and travel. My family background, I come from a military family and I grew up overseas. So I didn't actually live in England until I was 15. And so my plan was to go and live abroad and travel and do such things. However, what I found after sort of 4 or 5 years, I found the things I enjoyed, and I spent a long time in what was called leverage finance, doing deals. Then I went on to another job and another job and another job. And that's the great thing about banking. You can have hundreds of different careers in one organisation. And on average, I stayed in each job for 4 or 5 years before moving on to a new and better challenge. So I never really had this grand plan to be the CEO, which is why HR people don't like me, because I didn't have this sort of massive 10-year plan. But once I got to executive level, I realised as you do things and you learn things, I realised I really enjoyed strategy. I really enjoyed growing businesses. I loved running big teams, and I really enjoyed that dynamic of building teams. It comes a little bit from, I played a lot of sport when I was younger and I competed. And so that sort of progressed my career, and sort of I ended up transforming and running the corporate, commercial and private business of the bank. I became deputy CEO and then I became CEO. And the attraction of being CEO wasn't about being CEO. I know for some people that is the end game in their career. For me, it was, I had a vision for the bank, I had a strategy I wanted to follow, and I really felt I could build the team to deliver that. And that's really how I ended up being CEO and building a great team who delivered, great results. And my vision was always, you're in the seat as the CEO for a very short period of time. You're custodian of an organisation. Your job is to leave it in a better place than you inherited it and pass it on and build the team to take it forward. But really what underpinned my vision was building a long-term sustainable strategy. My job was to build long-term value for shareholders, long-term value and impact for customers, long-term value for the communities that we supported, and long-term value for our staff and our colleagues to build careers. And I think that way you're building really sustainable businesses rather than, in my industry in banking, we've been through that cycle of short-term profits, short-term gains, one-dimensional. So it was really about making sure we could deliver value for everyone and the long-term value and momentum.
Absolutely. And you clearly did achieve that and have grown the business. I guess as well, if we just unpick that a little bit, because I know we've talked about this before, and I think there's a couple of threads in there that I just want to pull out. The fact that you've worked in lots of different roles. So you've seen lots of different aspects of the business environment. I think that's really interesting. I think too, you very eloquently talked about delivering for all stakeholders. And I know that's something you are very passionate about. And also about being more longer term. Because in the UK, it's a bit of a disease, isn't it, Alison? We're very short term. So how we encourage organisations and stakeholders to think longer term has got to be so critical. So tell us about how you convinced the investors, convinced the rest of the board to take a bit longer in order to better shape that outcome, because any investor wants it yesterday, don't they?
I think it's a real challenge, particularly for publicly listed companies where you're in that quarterly reporting cycle. And I think it's about, you have to do both. The first point is, I think it starts from the fact that no business has any legitimacy to exist unless it's relevant to its customers. That is the most important thing, whether your customers are retail customers, private customers, market customers, whatever your business is, you have to be relevant. Otherwise, you have no right to exist. And we can see that, there's lots of research on the cycle of companies getting shorter. So first of all is relevance. Secondly, you have to be profitable and you have to be investable. So delivering value for shareholders is really important. But there's a difference between short-term shareholders and long-term shareholders. So it's really about gearing your strategy around the type of investor base you want to have. You don't often have the choice. So it's really about selling that vision, but making sure you're delivering clear steps on the path. So, I was very clear with my shareholders and my board, here is the long-term plan. We're going to make long-term investments in technology and transformation and growth. Here's what it's going to mean for customers. Here's what it's going to mean for shareholders. But each quarter we are going to deliver this. And so it's about building that. I said I would deliver, we delivered. Build credibility with your shareholders. And then they buy into your long-term goals because they measure you on what you're delivering each quarter, but they give you the ability to deliver the long term. So you're always balancing that short, long term. And then fundamentally, convincing the board is I'm going to deliver value for shareholders, which makes us investable. But fundamentally, any business without delivering value for customers and being able to attract the talent to drive the value for shareholders or be relevant in communities that you serve, where you have an accountability, then you're not managing all those elements of your stakeholder management. So it's kind of a matrix you have to put together in terms of a long-term vision and then short-term delivery, which is a path to the long term.
And that's very clear about being able to demonstrate the strategy, the stages of that strategy, and continuing delivering in the short term in order to do that, to make the bigger picture. You talked about relevance of customer and making sure that we remain relevant, and in the Institute we talk a lot about purpose, relevance and impact. And I do worry a little bit in today's day and age that we kind of chase short-term goals, as we were saying, rather than the longer-term piece. So what's your advice in terms of being able to make sure that the board, with all of your wisdom and experience, make sure that the board really does focus on the customer outcome? And how have you demonstrated that return on investment for them?
Yeah. In order to demonstrate the customer outcome, you really need to deeply understand your customers. And I think for any business, being very humble about your position is really important. Customers have, in any business, have lots of choices. So they can choose to do lots of things. And look, bankers can be, say we're very, very clever people, but fundamentally we offer finance and capital into the economy. It's a really important, critical role. But customers can choose to go anywhere for that, whether they are single retail customers or super sophisticated global customers or private wealth customers, whatever the business. And so deeply understanding your customers' needs today and the value that you're creating for the long term is what you have to do. And for me, in any business transformation, I always used to talk about the hygiene to value curve. It's very simple for lots of customers, and I'll speak about it in banking. Getting banking right, getting the basics right is the hygiene. There's nothing that annoys people. I mean, banking is not the thing that most people jump out of bed and get very excited about their banking. But when it goes wrong, it's a really super stressful, quite anxious moment. So getting your basics right is really important because your basics drive longevity, stickiness. Then building the value on top. And the value on top is not just value for you as an organization, it's value for the customer. And the very simple premise that I've seen in every single business that I have run, from the most simple to the most sophisticated customer, is if you do a really good job with them, if you build trust, if you build understanding with them, and you're trying to solve their problems, then they do more business with you. If they feel that you are an anonymous number and you're just selling them stuff, then you're utterly commoditized, and why would they trust you? And particularly in today's world where there is so much choice and so much mistrust, building relationships rather than transactions underpins it all. So for me, with the board, it was about looking at, here are our customers today, the value we drive today. But those customers grow, evolve. What are the trends? What are the demographics? What are those customers going to look like in 10 years? What are they going to need? What do we need to anticipate? And how do we make sure we grow with them as well as attracting customers and moving with them? And so it's painting not just a point in time story, but the whole future. And then for the customers, get the basics right, understand your customer and build value for them, and that will create value for you.
And that's very clear. Easy to say, Alison, but not always to deliver, and to deliver consistently well. And I suppose in terms of where we are now, you obviously are a senior advisor at Charterhouse, which must have been a very exciting move and very different, because I know you're working with lots of different organisations, international, UK-based, and a whole range of different sizes of organisations. We have still a relatively new government, just gone through the budget, great big focus on growth and how we're going to drive growth. So talk to us a little bit more about how you think a more strategic approach, which is what you've talked about, can really help an organisation deliver for its customers. And, where do we think the appetite is in the UK for trying to take that longer term focus as well in terms of doing that? And how do we drive that, I suppose, Alison?
It's always the real challenge. I mean, I think, if you remain short term in your outlook, and I think we have, I don't think it's a particularly UK problem. I think you can see it in lots of markets and a global problem. But the very short-termism has been you're solving the problem immediately in front of you. You have to do that. But actually, if you want to build long-term value, you've got to invest in the future as well. And so you're always having those trade-offs between, what happens today, what happens tomorrow. Generally, what I've seen, if you don't build on the infrastructure and the requirements, then you're going to fall off a cliff at some point. And we can see that in the UK. Our infrastructure hasn't been invested in, which means our ability to deliver value over the longer term gets really curtailed. So I think for any organisation, it's always the trade-off between, because you can never do everything at once. You can never satisfy everyone. It is a constant trade-off between, what is urgent and what is important today, and what is the value I'm creating tomorrow. So my business is here, 5-10 years' time. And frankly, that's the job of a CEO and the board. If they're not thinking about the longevity of their business and the value creation, and I would say they're not doing the job for the shareholders, because the shareholders are investing for the long term. So I think it's really that mindset and then trading off against the short term. But look, you've got to invest in the basics and the infrastructure. A lot of the pounds that we invested, hundreds of millions of pounds we invested in NatWest, was in the basic infrastructure of getting the hygiene right, making sure, the mobile app was up to date, making sure the branches were open, making sure the payments and the fraud protection was at the best level possible. That's not something you can see in the profit number, but you can see it because you're protecting customers, you're making sure that they're safe, you're making sure that you're competitive, and then you can move on to the value side. You have to do both.
And ultimately, Alison, if you don't do the former, then you will see it in the customer, you'll see it on the front page of whatever newspaper or maybe of that time. So absolutely, getting the hygiene factors making sure you deliver on your promises, which is what you're talking about, is critical. But having a service culture and this mindset of growth, which I think is quite interesting, because that will serve this country well. 80% of our GDP is services driven in the UK. 60% of our workforce are in some form of customer related role. So for me, this movement about trying to get people to understand the service isn't a contact centre or a department or a function is something that all of us, from the CEO across every aspect of the organisation, is really driving and really wants to kind of focus on. So consumer duty has, I guess, put a particular lens as well for the financial services. Is it a good thing, Alison? Or, where are we as far as you're concerned?
Look, I think consumer duty is a good thing. And I don't think you would get a single person in the financial services sector who would say the concept of treating customers fairly is the wrong thing. I would say that is in the DNA of what you want to do, and that is what everybody tries to do. I genuinely, that I'm not being glib, I think that's absolutely right. So consumer duty, making sure people are protected, getting fair deals, treated appropriately, absolutely right. The challenge is in how you execute it. And it's a little bit like any strategy is great strategy is only a great strategy if you can execute it well. And often you see brilliant strategies terribly executed. That doesn't mean the strategy is wrong, it just means the execution, which is why the team and the visibility is important. So I think the challenge with consumer duty is how you execute it, because you're dealing with, at the heart of it, a huge array of different types of customers. And this is really the challenge when you're dealing with hundreds of millions of customers. How do you make sure that you have the data and the insight and the visibility to know at any one point, where they are in their life, what their personal circumstances are, whether what they agreed to, they really understand, they know about is right for them at any point of time. And that's where technology is going to be, and data is a brilliant help to do that. And making sure we have that insight so that we can, the way I looked at it with consumer duty, is intervene when it looks like people are going off track or need help or it's no longer the right thing for them.
So a framework, the guidelines, and an attitude, in terms of the best parts of consumer duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the challenge is in the execution, because that's very easy to say, very hard to execute. And particularly and I think it is, again, when I look at the UK, people are very reluctant to talk about money. There's an embarrassment about talking about your financial affairs. One of our biggest challenges whenever we would always say is, look, if you're struggling, come and talk to us. But people often are very reluctant to admit they have challenges or talk to us or even know they may have problems. So I think it's in the execution of it. And one of the concerns about the implementation of consumer duty was we need to make sure that the penalty for getting it wrong doesn't make banks risk averse about supporting the most vulnerable. That was always my big concern, that what we would end up doing is solving for the lowest common denominator. We need time to get that data right, and therefore would that make people stop lending to the people who need it most?
Or even price the situation where you couldn't afford to, which is the other aspect, because regulation is expensive and, you have to be able to resource that appropriately in terms of the compliance, etc. So that is always the balance, isn't it? About making sure you get the right outcome, so law or unintended consequences to stop, perhaps products or services being removed because, frankly, they're not profitable. So that balance, I think, is something that any organisation in financial services is constantly, as you said earlier, everything's about trade-off, making sure that you try to do the right thing, but understanding the implications of that. And I think, if I was honest, Alison, I think the FCA have got better at understanding that, and I think they would recognise that they are on a journey with that, but there is more to be done. I think for me, if I thought about consumer duty, the one thing I really, because we work with a lot of regulators, the one thing I really do quite like about it is the responsibility in the boardroom as well, and making the non-exec more responsible for that has had a good impact. How do you feel about that? Or do you think that's not necessary?
Look, I think it depends on the quality of your board. It being a core part of what a board and an executive team should be thinking about, and having the visibility to know when things, to have that visibility, know when things are going right or going wrong. So it's all about good governance. It's all about transparency. And so, the board having accountability for that is and visibility of that is really important. I always think when you're running a very large organization, it's those things that pop up that can tell you whether things are going right or wrong, because you can't watch everything all at once. And so being able to talk at the board about, consumer duty, are we doing the right thing? Can we see we're doing the right thing? Or can we see we're doing the wrong thing? And what are the signals is super important.
Absolutely. And also helps perhaps with some of that investor conversation as well, which, keeps it firmly back to why are we all here in terms of trying to serve the customer, notwithstanding, as we said, we don't want to be regulated to death so we become inertia or too expensive.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things with regulations is, with that environment, you want to make sure you keep all of this within the regulated sector. So that is, one of the consequences, making sure particularly large organizations like NatWest, like Lloyds, like Barclays, those big institutional banks, they're covering customers from all dimensions, from the most simple to the most sophisticated, from the wealthiest to the poorest. I mean, it is the nature of what they do. And making sure that they can support all of that customer base with the appropriate products and the appropriate support while creating value for shareholders is really important. What you don't want is an unintended consequence of some of those products no longer being available and those customers having to seek that from non-regulated spaces, which may not be as good.
Absolutely. I think completely understand and concur with that. And also, to your point, we're living in a much more complex world. We've got AI and the impact of different channels and different digital applications. But also that raises, doesn't it, more chance of fraud, more chance of cyber attack, all of that kind of aspect as well, which is a heavy burden for a financial services organisation. So just going to tech, what do you see, Alison, as the best opportunities for us to deploy tech? And where are some of the things you're a bit more sceptical about?
Yeah, and look, I'm a huge proponent of and very excited about the developments in AI and of technology. I think it is a way of providing greater consistency, greater insight, greater speed, greater relevance to customers. So I think it's hugely valuable. Just, the example we were talking about, consumer duty, the use of data insights, of behavioral science, of the analytics we can now use, the use of AI, allow us to spot behaviors and problems and predictive views of customers, which we wouldn't be able to see or spot the patterns. And that is all helpful for customers. It's the same with fraud, actually. The level of insight that technology can provide now to spot those patterns of when fraudsters have control of a customer's account or have done something and we can see something unusual. It's not foolproof because, it's always a constant battle. So I think technology and AI allows us more insight, more consistency, and more speed to help us support customers. What are the downsides? Data is only good as data in. Technology is only as good as it being used well. AI is amazing in the hands with the right outcome. So having an ethical approach to how you use data. And my approach has always been, we have amazing data on customers, but that is the customer's data. And using their data and other data to help them is what your ethical approach should be. Using that data to sell it to someone else is not ethical use of data. But, that was always my approach. So I think there are huge advantages, but it's always about how you use the technology, what outcomes you are trying to achieve, and making sure you are looking at the pros and cons of that.
And relating back, as you said, to purpose and what we're trying to do, and are we trying to make this easier for the customer? Are we able to protect the customer? Are we able to see those patterns? And I can absolutely see that. And I think it's interesting, Alison, where we would certainly feel the whole of AI is going to add a huge value is around data and being able to get through complex, huge amounts of data, back to your point, to be able to give patterns, stories, and insight in a way that actually we could have only hoped for 20 years ago. Where I find it less helpful is we're just considering it to replace the human interface. And I think that's the balance, isn't it, about how we're using the tech to get the right outcome for the business and also the customer. So I think we have to think very carefully about just because we can, should we, which is what you nicely were talking about before, about ethical use of data?
The way I've always thought about technology and data is, and the strategy that I'd always pursued it is people sort of empowered by data and technology empowering people in data. And it is making sure, and I think it is always about the outcome. You know, we used to partner with, and I continue to partner with lots of fintech and startups, and I think that partnership was really great. But you can have fantastic tech, but for what purpose? And so really aligning it to, and that's true of every entrepreneur. You can create something. What are you going to do with it? What's the purpose? What's the value? Where's your go-to-market? So using technology in the right way, I think, is massively empowering. And I'll give you, a small example, which was, we used with some of our data and our AI patterning at the bank. We were able to map where customers were using ATMs that cost them money. So we were able to advise customers, the next ATMs, 200 yards, it will save you money. And that saved our customers, we saved hundreds of millions of pounds for customers.
And a good use of nudge, actually, too, nudging people to do the right things, like also alerting people about, you've got this money in this account, you need to move it, or all of that kind of more positive stepping into. We see that in our data all the time, where organisations look to help or look to positively engage. More difficult sometimes in financial services because we're a bit more suspicious and we're a bit more worried.
I used to say the use of data, you have to use it for insight rather than being creepy. Put that insight in the hands of the customer so they can choose what they do with it.
Coming up with things that actually only I should know and trying to tell me about that gets a bit creepy, doesn't it, in terms of that bit? Alison, we started the conversation when I was introducing you about the importance of attracting more women into business and particularly entrepreneurship. Where do you think we are on this journey, and what more can we do to make sure that we really are attracting and retaining, which I think is the other big issue, the most diverse workforce we possibly can? Because we know that it's available to us, but somehow we're still struggling, aren't we, to really attract that?
Yeah, and look, I think this comes back to a really cool business imperative. When you're running a business in a competitive market, you want the best team possible. That's your baseline. You want absolutely the best talent around the table. But I think a really important part of leadership is bringing, diverse voices around the table, because that will make you more competitive and it will avoid groupthink. It's very easy to recruit people who look like you, sound like you, from the same background, who will furiously agree with you about everything. I would say that is a disaster for any business that wants to be competitive. So I think diversity and inclusion is about making sure you break any stereotypes and allow talent to thrive, and you get the most competitive, talented group around the table, because that's how business wins. That's your fundamental starting place. And the reality is everybody is completely different. They will have different perceptions of business. Financial services is still perceived as very male-dominated, but getting better. What that job might mean is really by encouraging people in breaking down, any stereotypes and really encouraging talent to thrive. And I think that's super important. So I think that's a baseline that underpins it.
And as you said, in any business.
In any business. If you're in a business where you want to win, which of course that's what you want to do, having the best people around you is the most important. If you're excluding 50% of the population because they're women, then you clearly do not have the best people around the table. You can see that through, the quality of school results, graduates, performance. You just know that's not the case. So make your organisation the most competitive and the most successful. That's a baseline. I think on the entrepreneurship and the female entrepreneurship side, and the reason that we started with the Rose Review was back to research that one of the great privileges I had when I was running the commercial bank in NatWest was I was able to look at, small businesses and entrepreneurs. And there was a real gap between how you help entrepreneurs really starting out, because loading them with huge amounts of debt is not the answer. But what we found was that 47% of people didn't start businesses because they didn't know where to get help and fear of failure. So great idea, really wanted to do it, but didn't know how to start. So what we did, we set up 14 free accelerators around the UK. Didn't have to bank with us. And it was really for the entrepreneurs. And we put all of our bankers through the same training process. But having got that up and running, we saw that 47% of the entrepreneurs in our accelerators were women. You hadn't set any criteria. no targets. It was all about creating this ecosystem where you could bring different support in. And that led me to doing sort of, well, why is that? When I look at the national average, and then I would talk to entrepreneurs, and you suddenly have all these stories. So that triggered the Rose Review, which I did with the Treasury. And what we found was, and it was done as a very data-led, global-led research, really looking at what the problem was, and also the opportunity, most importantly. And the opportunity was, if we could get women to start and scale businesses at the same level as best-in-class countries, then we could add 250 billion to the UK economy. So from a productivity and growth perspective, this is untapped potential. And then we looked at what the practical barriers were, because what I wanted to make sure we did was, rather than just produce a report and stare at the problems and go, look, that's a really big problem, was actually how can we intervene practically and immediately to find a way. And what we found was the reasons for this. There was a real lack of finance going to women. So less than 1% of VC money was going to female entrepreneurs.
What do you think that was?
I think there are lots of reasons. There are very few women in private equity or VC. Women don't have access to the usual networks that get them introduced into that. There is a perception that women are more risk averse. Actually, they're more risk aware, so they tend to ask for less. There are fewer women coming through the pipeline. The scale-up capital gap, there is a kind of perception of lack of ambition. So there are a number of different sort of problems which are broader than just the VC community. There was also the point that the usual networking events, and I generalise for impact, were 8 o'clock in a hotel bar. Most women are not going to do that. And so there were a myriad of reasons. Also, a lot of family and caring responsibilities fall on women. So there were all these different reasons. So what we tried to do was put interventions in place. What we found, if I think about the 3-year mark after the report, the amount of VC money going to women had gone up to like 5%. Okay, so it had improved. But we also had 200 organisations signed up to the Investing in Women's Code, which signposted where to go in order to get help and support. We saw the number of women now running businesses, 20% of businesses are now run by women. And we saw almost a 20% increase in the number of women starting and scaling businesses. The most positive dynamic, I thought, was in the 18 to 24-year-old group. There was almost a 300% increase in women starting businesses. So I think that if you open up the ecosystem, if you put the right support in place, the right finance at the right point, the right help, if you signpost where you can go for help and put those measures in place, you can have a really big impact. And the prize is a 250 billion contribution to the UK economy. So it's not like we don't have entrepreneurs. We have entrepreneurs. We're not helping them enough. And just saying, and every organisation is guilty of this, but there's lots of help out there. When you're running a business and running a family and doing 2 jobs and setting up a business, it's really lonely. For entrepreneurs, I have enormous respect for them, but it's super lonely. And so therefore, any organisation that helps should go and help and find a way to make it easy, because the outcome is, these entrepreneurs are starting businesses, they're creating jobs, they're creating contribution to the economy. And the UK economy is 60% of turnover comes from small and medium-sized businesses. 50% of people are employed by small and medium-sized businesses. You need a thriving entrepreneur growth to really move the economy. If you don't get it right at the starting point, you're not going to get the drive through. So we need to help them at startup very significantly, which is where we were also starting to intervene with the Rose Review, was at scale up. Too many companies don't scale, or because our pool of capital is so much smaller here in the UK, they go to the US for scale. And growth is valued.
You lose.
So you lose.
But that you've actually put in the bottom end as well. Into it.
Yes. So I think the whole support for entrepreneurship is a really vital part of having a really thriving growth economy. And it's a very similar principle. If you've got people who have that vision and passion and drive to start businesses, we should do everything we can to support them, get them started, and put the right capital in at the right places to help them scale and grow.
And your passion is very evident about this, Alison. We touched on an interesting, let's put it like that, landscape that we are currently operating in the UK. Pretty challenging. New government that has come in, just gone through the budget. Talking about small businesses, we've seen an increase, obviously, in NI and minimum wage. Mixed reactions, as you might expect from that, and they're all good and bad that might be related to that. What would you hope for, Alison, based on this? Because for me, it's kind of, if I was being honest, I think it's good to see that there is a focus on growth and a vision, because so much of this depends on us actually shooting for things. I mean, that's what you were really talking about, being entrepreneurial, really setting that landscape to be able to go for something. So how would you like business to respond to the budget, I suppose, is one of my questions. And what else can we do to get this growth?
I think for businesses, any business, whether it's small, medium or large, generally when I've spent time talking to businesses, what they want is certainty and clarity. The people who are going to grow businesses are the business owners. That's what's going to happen. And so almost government needs to get out of the way and create the right environment for businesses to thrive and succeed and to grow. And I think, what we have to remember is that contribution that businesses make to the economy. They're creating jobs, they're creating receipts and revenues that pay taxes, that contribute.
Back to your point about being able to, really kind of focus on that. The community, you touched on about that before, being part of something that is bigger in order to be able to create better outcomes, better lives for people.
So I think for, what would I want businesses to do? I see no lack of ambition in entrepreneurship in this country or in small business. And, a great example would be that during COVID, the resilience of business, and I've talked about this before, if you'd said to all businesses across the country, this is what you're going to have to go through for the next 2 years, they would have all gone, there's no way we're going to survive. There was a lot of support put in place, but fundamentally it was down to the ingenuity of business owners and how they took care of their staff and loads of creativity. So I think what's really important is making sure you create that environment where businesses can thrive. I'm a little worried about the, national insurance increase, because the reality is, in practical terms, businesses have an envelope of costs that they can operate within. And if that cost has gone up and they can't afford it, then they'll cut. That's the reality. But I think if you can give them certainty of the investment regime, certainty of taxation, incentives for growth, incentives for scale, then businesses will find a way. What we need to remember in the UK is we are competing on a global stage. Businesses will go where they can get the most growth, the most incentive, the most access to market. So we need to make sure that the requirements for growth are supported in a practical way. Remember, we're competing globally.
And to your earlier point about strategy is one thing, you've got to have a really good executional plan, and that is exactly the same in terms of how we're trying to drive growth going forward. Alison, we've talked a lot in a very short period of time about the importance of diversity. You're very eloquent about why entrepreneurship is so important. I couldn't agree more in terms of SMEs and small business and that opportunity to grow. We've talked quite a bit about service and why, being at the heart of everything, and we've talked about AI. One of the areas too, for me, that we see coming out a lot in the UK CSI is organisations having an ethical practice, doing the right thing, and reputation, having a good reputation. And in order to drive on what you were talking about was sustainable business practices. What more do you think we could do in the UK to encourage that? Because where I guess I'm going with this, Alison, is about having people like you leading organisations with a service culture in mind, with having, that longer term approach, by having, doing the right thing, I think is so important. And I worry sometimes that going back to that short term, we sacrifice that a little bit. So any pearls of wisdom to make sure that we keep the reputation in the right place?
I see, some exceptional CEOs around the UK really, really driving that. And I think making sure that we are creating the environment, making sure that we have boards that are, the quality of the board is really important to make sure you've got the right environment to really support that long-term strategic vision and that short-term execution. And one of the things that is, I think a real challenge globally for any CEO at the moment is, you're dealing with these 1 in 100 year events every 6 months. The world has become more unpredictable. That ability to produce a 5-year plan and know broadly you can stick to it is almost impossible because of, the geopolitical, and particularly at the moment, geopolitical eats economics every day. But all of those trends. So I think having CEOs who are comfortable with not knowing the answer, I think is really important, because, it's really important to be agile and respond to the environment. Having boards that are ambitious and growth driven rather than risk averse, I think is super important, and creating that environment where you can grow. And obviously they're making sure that the political and policy environment allows you to do that. I think as the UK, we have to recognise that we're competing, as we have always done, on a global stage, that the world has become more connected through technology, which is a good thing. And therefore we need to make sure that we are keeping our eyes on the global horizon. I know there's a lot of shift now between things becoming local rather than global, and everybody talks about it, but any small business owner will tell you they want to grow their business into the markets will give them the greatest value. So I think, the right CEO, the right board with growth ambitions, ability to be agile and respond, recognise things never go in a straight line, and recognise we're competing globally. And when we do that, when you bring those ingredients together, I think the UK is excellent at it. We have amazing entrepreneurs. We have amazing sectors, financial services, life science, consumer businesses. We have incredible businesses. So creating the ability for those businesses to succeed and celebrate business and its contribution, and really encourage that long-term thinking so that we can create value, build on that value, build on growth.
Alison Rose, very, very clear, as always, very articulate, and very inspirational, may I say, too, about really thinking in a world, as you said, that is very uncertain, but rather than admiring the problem, you've given us some really good practical things that we can do as businesses to drive that forward. I've got one last question for you. If there was one change that a business leader could implement today, if there is ever one, but if there was one, to make sure that the future of service and customer service is seen in the rightful place, which is what we've talked about, what would that be?
Make your team talk to customers. The answer is in every single business. If I think about whenever the businesses I've run, whenever we were sitting around an executive table trying to wrestle with a problem, the answer was always with the teams on the ground facing customers or the customers. So the one thing I would say in any organisation is don't rely on the hierarchy. Make sure you go and talk to your customers. Ask them what they want, what they need, what they feel. That might not be the answer that you can deliver, but talking to your customers and talking to your colleagues who face your customers, you get much more real insight to what the opportunity is. So don't sit in the boardroom. Get out and talk to your customers.
Alison Rose, thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
I really enjoyed our conversation, and I personally gleaned some fascinating insights from Dame Alison about her approach towards leadership, as well as where she sees things developing in terms of the economy more broadly. So join us again for the next episode of Causonomics, where I'll be catching up with HMRC's Deputy Chief Executive, Angela MacDonald, to get a public servant's view on why the customer experience really matters. So until then, go careful. Thank you.